In the last segment, we almost finished discussing the reign of Reza Shah. And in this segment, I just want to wrap up the remainder of that discussion. If you recall from the last section, I mentioned that one of the things that Reza Shah did was to nationalize and modernize Iran's entire educational system. And this was really part of the phenomena we mentioned, centralization of power, that he had established. So by nationalizing, the education became uniform. It did away with the Islamic Maktab as the basis for learning, and he also opened Tehran University. So he had a great deal of accomplishment in the field of education. And I should also mention that even the Presbyterian school that was ran by the American missionaries had to close down under this new regulations and centralization of education. He also gave Iran a legal system, a new legal system based on Napoleonic Code, which now replaced the Islamic Sharia as a basis for laws and civil laws and criminal laws. So all of these accomplishments under Reza Shah is sort of symbolic of the kind of achievement you would expect to get under authoritarian modernizers. And in that sense, there's no question that he was very, very successful in bringing about change. But a lot of traditional leaders, as you may guess, were very unhappy about what he was doing. He was literally changing the face of Iran, and in the major city, the face of Tehran. It is well known that he hated the tight little alleys that was the remnant of the Iran's past. They're called kuche. And he, therefore, actually Iranian cities were very much characterized by having these tight alleys, the kuches. He ordered bulldozers into the middle of the cities and destroyed houses in order to create open boulevards and open spaces. Again, that's the kind of policy you would expect authoritarian modernizers to undertake. And those who favored change obviously were very happy with these changes he was bringing about. And in fact, the lower you get down the pyramid of the public opinion, the more pro-change one is, the more happier one would be with the kind of changes and developments that Reza Shah was accomplishing. Again, because for the lower strata, the liberal norms are purely instrumental. They really don't mean much to them. So for them, what matters is change itself, whether it's done by liberal means or by authoritarian means. On the other hand, intellectuals really disliked him for his dictatorial ways and for his dictatorial rule. He really didn't care much about democracy. The only thing he cared about primarily was, of course, to modernize Iran. So by the time that he has consolidated power, Iran really does have a control system that is centralized and that is real. And all of these changes that we're talking about are brought in a very, very brief span of time. You're looking at about 21 years from 1921 to 1942. One could guess that probably in the 2.5 millennium of Iran up to that point, this probably was the fastest period of change this ancient country had ever experienced. Now, going back to Reza Shah's rule, by the 1930s, he had pretty much established control internally, but in that period, Reza Shah did commit a big mistake in his external relations. Internally, everything was under control. What happened was that this is the time that Hitler is coming to power in Germany in the early 1930s, and Reza Shah begins to play with Hitler in the sense of trying to see if he could work things out with him. There are two motives for Reza Shah's decision to start approaching Hitler or being receptive to Hitler. First was he wanted to free himself from the British. He knew very well that Iranian regarded the 1921 coup as British sponsored, and therefore in the eyes of many Iranians who were politically aware, they saw Reza Shah as a British agent. And for him to have nationalistic legitimacy, he needed to free himself from the British. And secondly, the other thing that made him attracted to Hitler was because Hitler was offering him some very good economic terms and aids, and he knew he needed help from foreign countries to accelerate the pace of change in Iran. And to do so, he would need to get that money from Hitler. Really, there was not much idea for him as far as the anti-Semitic feelings were concerned. He wasn't attracted to that part of Hitler. And remember, for most of Middle East, Hitler was attractive because he was the enemy of their primary tormentor, and that tormentor, as you know well by now, was Britain and secondarily France. So in the 30s, what happens is that the Germans sent a lot of people who would be considered by many as the fifth column in Iran. So throughout Iran, there are a lot of German agents. Now, up to that point, the British had been pretty happy with Reza Shah's rule because he provided what they wanted most, considering Iran as a buffer zone, and that was stability. But as we approach World War II, he begins to look uglier. That is, the Reza Shah begins to look uglier to the British, and they don't want him in any way to get close to Hitler. Therefore, the British issue an ultimatum in 1941 to get rid of the Germans. And again, you got to remember, in the context of international history, this is a period that British really felt intensely threatened by Hitler in Germany. So when Reza Shah refused to honor the ultimatum, you had the Allies forces, mostly British and Russian, to march into Iran. And that's, of course, 1941. You get the foreign invasion of Iran. Part of that outcome of that invasion was that he is officially allowed to abdicate, that is, Reza Shah is allowed to abdicate in favor of his son, and Reza Shah himself is exiled to Mauritius and then later on to South Africa, where he dies. Now, what is interesting about this course of events is that Iranian had a very common pattern of interpretation regarding Reza Shah's fall, and in their view, him being dumped by the British. And the interpretation goes something along this line. Whenever one of your agents goes beyond the space allowed by your leash, then you're going to get dumped. And the consensus was that by going beyond his leash, Reza Shah was, in a sense, violating the limits that the British had set for him, and therefore he was going to get dumped. And the fact that the Russians were part of the invasion force didn't matter, because after all, among the imperial powers, there is a sense of hegemonic unity. That is, even though they compete and they have conflict, they compete with each other and they have conflict, when the chips are down and they're being challenged, the whole hegemony is being challenged, ultimately they will unite. So whenever there is a major threat confronting the imperialists, rather than competing and fighting with each other, what they normally do is to unite and get rid of this challenge. You may also recall when we discussed Ayatollah Khomeini's worldview in the previous segments, He had put United States, Soviet Union, and Western Europe as one group, a group of hegemonic oppressors, under a group that actually was was suppressing the oppressed people. So in his theory, the same type of law operates. The oppressors will unite whenever they're challenged by the oppressed. And this is also true of the way most of the Middle East see the imperial behaviors, even though they compete among each other, when they're confronted with a major threat, they will unite. And the pattern is well internalized among Iranians. They believe this is the case, and so is the case with the Arabs in the Middle East. You also see this pattern later on repeated when we talk about the fall of Mossadegh, and again in connection to Iran-Iraq war under Khomeini. So to conclude about Reza Shah, let me point out that without question his reign was a dictatorial one. Nevertheless, one can make a very credible case that Reza Shah ought to be viewed as the father of modern Iran. During his reign of 2 decades, he almost single-handedly transformed Iran from a centuries of feudal society into a fledgling, modern, centralized state. So by any account, the amount of change that was instantiated under his reign was historically unprecedented for Iran. Now let's move on to the next period, and the next period is the period during the World War II period. Iran is under the occupation of the Allies, and this occupation begins in 1942 and for the most part ends in 1945. You will see why I said for the most part, because there's an episode in 1946 that I will address shortly. So what I want to do next is to give you a sense of the kind of control system that existed when there was occupation of Iran. So let's look at the control system under the occupation, and again looking at the familiar compliance system that I discussed in the earlier segments. At the primary level, you have, of course, coercion, because Iran is an occupied country, and this time the coercion is by foreign forces, including Britain, Russia, and United States. So the occupying power are these 3 allies. And remember, Iran was very important for the occupation, for the Allies, because it was considered the route by which the West could supply Russia with military hardware and other supplies to fight Hitler. So Iran is the supply path to the Soviet Union. And again, don't forget, Iran had close to 1,600 kilometers of border with the former Soviet Union. At the secondary level, you have the British taking advantage of the occupation and trying to bring back the land-owning elites, almost a throwback to the feudal system that Reza Shah worked so hard to change and eliminate. U is relatively low. These are not good times in Iran. There are some scarcities about food and other material needs of the country, and the occupation doesn't really help that very much. And finally, in fact, the occupation makes it worse, because a lot of the agriculture stuff is being bought by the Allied forces to feed the troops, so there is less food available for the Iranians. And then the last one, and normative active, that is at the lowest point. When you're an occupied country, there is very little sense of legitimacy to the ruling elites who are cooperating with the occupied powers. So it's not a legitimate system at all, and everybody is hoping for the end of the world war so that Iran can be free once again. Now, for the United States, this is a kind of an interesting point to reflect on it. We entered Iran as a very liberal state, and for the most part, we were genuinely sympathetic to Iran's aspiration. But by the time we're going to leave Iran, at least for a very long time, this is going to be in 1979, after the Iranian Revolution, we left Iran pretty much because we had adopted the very same policies of the British at the time when we left Iran. Now, the next period of importance is 1946. The war was over in 1945, and as promised by the Allies at the time of their invasion, the Allies agreed to leave Iran as soon as the war ended. The British and the American troops left. However, the Soviet troops refused to leave Iran, and so that led to a crisis. It's called the Azerbaijan crisis. Those of you who are interested in international relations, you may have learned down the line that in 1946, the Azerbaijan crisis is considered by many scholars to be the beginning of the Cold War conflict. The refusal of Stalin to remove the Soviet troops from northern Iran, where they had occupied it during the war, triggered that conflict, and therefore that was a really seminal event in international relations in terms of bringing about the start of the Cold War. And so right off the bat, Iran is a very, very important, strategically critical country because the Cold War means that the United States and the West are very concerned about Soviet influence there. The 1946 Azerbaijan crisis gets resolved by Soviet Union finally agreeing to leave Iran. The case is one of the most misunderstood one in international politics because some people credit United States being tough on the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union behaving like a tiger, paper tiger, and leaving. Others credit Iran's cunning for making the Soviet Union believe that they were going to get concession when in fact they didn't, and once they left they couldn't come back. The truth of the matter is that the Soviet interest in Azerbaijan probably was not anywhere as intense as was presumed either by Iranians or by the Americans and the Europeans, and that by this time they are getting preoccupied with Eastern Europe, and so Stalin's focus shifted away, and so they left Iran. But that case study is, let me put it this way, the explanation that I gave you is not a widely accepted one in the annals of history, but if you do a more careful case study, as others have done, the evidence is pretty good that the Soviet left and their interest was not as strong as had been assumed. So with 1946 behind us, we get to a period in which the government of Iran is beginning to take shape with the foreign troops out. The Shah who succeeded his father, his name is Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the last name. He is very young, very inexperienced, and already there is an attempt at assassination when he goes to Tehran University. He is wounded, but after the assassination, he decides to be tougher and to take better control of the government.